listeners and viewers. Welcome to Kaduna State Ministry of Education Radio and TV e-learning program designed for our SS3 and other students staying at home due to the coronavirus pandemic. The present administration, under the able leadership of His Excellency, Malam Nasir Ahmed El-Rufai, is positioned, as always, to ensure that under his leadership, our students are not left behind in all areas of human endeavors, especially education. Kaduna State is the center of learning. Therefore, we want to ensure that our students excel in their forthcoming examinations and beyond. Students and other learners at home are given this opportunity in order to continue learning, as education is a continuous process. Different subjects will be taught in this program to assist students to perform excellently in the forthcoming Senior School Certificate examination being conducted by NECO and WAEC as soon as schools reopen. Teachers making presentations will always provide their names and phone numbers during each presentation, and they can be contacted for questions, further explanations, and/or clarifications. The following numbers and contacts can also be reached for expression of any concern or observation: 090-865-00545 or 080-383-62072. Our website is www.education.kdsg.gov.ng. Our email education@kdsg.gov.ng or education.kdsg@gmail.com. Our YouTube channel, Ministry of Education, Kaduna State. Our Twitter handle @Kaduna_MOE. Or our Facebook page, Ministry of Education, Kaduna State. Stay safe, stay at home, and learn well. Thank you, happy listening, and happy viewing.
Hello students, you are welcome to another segment of e-learning. My name is Mariam Ahmed Gidado. My subject is biology, and our topic for today is going to be major agent of pollination. My student, if you can remember in the previous lesson, we started with types of pollination, where we explained two types of pollination and the features favoring each of the type. We have already discussed features favoring self-pollination, but because of time factor, we were not able to finish it. So today we are going to start with that before we go into our main topic, which is agent of pollination. Okay, features of favoring cross-pollination. There are three features which favor cross-pollination. These features are dichogamy, self-sterility, or self-incompatibility, and we also have unisexuality. So what is dichogamy? Dichogamy refers to the ripening of anther and stigma of a bisexual flower at the same time. That is when the male gamete and the female gamete matured or ripens at the same time. Sorry, at different times. That is what we call dichogamy. Homogamy is at the same time. Dichogamy is at different times. So we have two types of dichogamy. We have protandry and we have protogyny. What is protandry? Protandry refers to the condition in which the anthers of a flower matured earlier than stigma of the flower. That is when the male gamete or the male reproductive system of the flower mature before the female. That condition is known as protandry, and it is found in some flowers. Then we have protogyny. Protogyny refers to the condition in which the stigma of the flower matures earlier than its own pollen grain. Here, protogyny, the female reproductive organ matures before the male reproductive organ. So these two features, when male matures before the female, the only option is cross-pollination. The same thing when female matures before the male, the only option is cross-pollination. So these features, protandry and protogyny, encourages cross-pollination in plants or in flowers. Then the next one is supposed to be self-sterility. What is self-sterility? This is also known as Self-incompatibility is also known as self-sterility. It refers to the situation in which some plants make themselves self-sterile, meaning some plants make themselves incompatible to others. That is, when pollen grains of other plants drop on the stigma of that plant, the pollen grain dies, it doesn't germinate, meaning it is not compatible. It is making the flower to be sterile, it will not germinate. So the only option is to cross-pollinate the pollen grains of other flower to go and germinate, pollinate the stigma of another flower, but it cannot pollinate the stigma of that same flower. That condition is called self-sterility or self-incompatibility, meaning the male and the female of that same flower are not compatible. So pollination cannot take place between the two of them. Then the next one is unisexuality. What is unisexuality? In dioecious plants such as pawpaw, only cross-pollination can occur as the male and female flowers are born on separate plants, such species have protected their adaptation for achieving cross-pollination. We said in pawpaw plants, the male flower is different from the female flower, or maybe the maize plant. You have the male flower different from the female flower. So in such a plant, cross-pollination is the only option. There is nothing like, cross-pollination is the only option. There is nothing like self-pollination because the flowers are not on the same plant. So these are the three conditions that make cross-pollination favorable. Then let us quickly look at advantages of cross-pollination. It leads to the production of healthier offspring and also produce viable seed. That is, cross-pollination produce healthier offspring that are more viable, with seed that are more viable. It leads also to the formation of varieties because there is cross-pollination, so there is introduction of new genes. So when new genes are introduced, definitely varieties will be produced also. Then there is also offspring produced through pollination are more adapted to environmental conditions. When offspring are being produced by cross-pollination, because genes have combined, there are now new varieties. So those new varieties make the individual to be healthier and to adapt to more conditions within the plant. Then what are the disadvantages? The disadvantages of cross-pollination include cross-pollination relies on external agents. Self-pollination, the plant can pollinate itself. But in cross-pollination, new agents from outside have to come. And there is no guarantee that agent is definitely coming. So when it is time for cross-pollination, there has to be agents. And when the agents are not there, the cross-pollination might not be able to take place. Then it may lead to wastage of pollen grains, especially pollination by wind. We said transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma is pollination. So when pollen grains are being transferred, in the process of the transfer, pollen grains are being wasted, much especially if the plant is pollinated by wind, because the wind will carry the pollen grain. Instead of carrying it directly to the plant, it can waste it along the line. So it might not pollinate the flower at the end of it. That is what you mean by wastage of cross-pollination. So my students, we are going to now start our topic, which is major agent of pollination. We have discussed what was remaining in the last lesson. So the major agent of pollination are insect and wind. That is, insect pollinated flowers. They are also called anemophilous flowers. The common insects that pollinate flowers are bees, the wasps, the beetles, the butterflies, moths, and also the ants. Then the insect pollinated flowers have some characteristics which is peculiar to them. They have large conspicuous petals. If you can remember, we made mention of corolla and calyx, the petals and the sepals. So when a flower is insect pollinated, the petals or the sepals are very conspicuous. That is, they are very broad, and flowers are also usually brightly colored. They are broad and the colored very attractive so that it can attract the insect to come to the flower. Pollen grains are rough, sticky, and relatively few. They are few because they are not carried by wind. They are carried by insect, and they have to be sticky so that the pollen grains can stick to the body of the insect, and they are also rough. So in that way, in that process, they are able to stick the body to the body of the insect so that the insect can carry it from the anther to the stigma. The stigma is flat with sticky surface to enable it to receive pollen grains. That is, the surface of the stigma is also sticky so that when the insect is on it, it can stick to the stigma, and the stigma will now receive the pollen grains. Petals are shaped and arranged to enable visiting insect become dusted with pollen grains. Example of insect pollinated flowers include hibiscus, pride of Barbados, flamboyant, and closelary. So having looked at the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers, let's look at the process the insect follow in pollinating the flower. When insects that pollinate the flower, such as pride of Barbados, are the swallowtail butterfly and the bees. Meaning we are talking of the insect that visit that plant, that is butterfly and bees. When the insect lands on the standard petal, the pride of Barbados have about 5 petals. One of them is known as the standard petal. So usually that is the petal on which the butterfly or the insect drop on it, and it inserts what is called the proboscis. The butterfly or the bee has a structure which is called the proboscis, and it is the proboscis that the insect insert into the flower. That standard flower directs the insect to where the nectar is. The nectar is what the flower is producing. It's a sweet substance which the butterfly feeds on. So in the process of feeding on the nectar, the butterfly transfers the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So when the butterfly lands on the standard petal, it releases the proboscis and it's directed into the nectar. So during this process, the hairy body or wings of the butterfly or bee touches the pollen grains, and this stick to the body or the wings of the insect. That is, in the process of getting the nectar, after it has released the proboscis, then the pollen grains that are already matured, they get stick to the body of the butterfly or the bee, either to the body or to the wings. Then when this insect visits another flower of pride of Barbados, the pollen grains on its body or wings touches the stigma of the flower, thereby bringing about pollination. That is, when the insect lands on the petal, then the pollen grains stick to the body of the insect. So when the insect finishes taking the nectar, it visits another flower. So when it visits another flower, already the pollen grains are there. So the pollen grains are now dusted on the stigma of that second flower, bringing about cross-pollination. Then let's look at characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers. So wind-pollinated flowers are also called anemophilous flowers, and they have the following characteristics. They have small inconspicuous petals or sepals. That is, the sepals or petals are not broad, just like in insect pollinated flowers. They are dull colored. They don't have bright colors. That is, those flowers that are being pollinated by wind do not have bright color, and they don't have scent. They don't have nectar as in insect pollinated. So the scent and the nectar are absent in wind pollinated because wind is not insect. So they don't have nectar, and they produce large quantity of pollen grains because the pollen grains are being transferred by wind. So in the process of the transfer, many of the pollen grains are being wasted. So they have to be produced in large quantity if they have to reach the flower, because the insect carry many of the pollen grains. Pollen grains are small, smooth, light, and also not sticky. Since this time around it is not the insect that is pollinating the flower, it is the wind. They just have structures that make them to fly on air, because it is the wind that is carrying, so they are not sticky. They don't stick to the body of any insect because they are not pollinated by insect. They are being blown by wind to reach the stigma. The stigma is elongated and sticky with large surface area. That is the stigma of wind pollinated flower. They have to be elongated. They have to be tossed in such a way that if the wind blows the pollen grains, they will be able to touch the stigma. Anthers are attached to the flower in such a way that they readily swing in the air and release the pollen grains. Meaning the anther of wind-pollinated flowers, they swing so that when the wind blows, they can easily be carried to the next stigma. Examples of wind-pollinated flowers are maize, guinea, rice, millet, and wheat. Then let's look at process of pollination by wind. Let's look at maize as an example. The maize plants have the male flower different from the female flower, and it's being pollinated by wind. So the male flower is up and the female flower is down. So when wind blows, the pollen grains from the male flower drop on the stigma of the female flower. The structure is, for those that are viewers, the structure is on the bottom. The male flowers are on top, so when they are blown by wind, they now pollinate the stigma of the female flower. Let's quickly look at differences between insect-pollinated flowers. Flowers are usually large in insect, but they are usually small and inconspicuous in wind. They are usually bright colored in insect, they are usually dull colored in wind. There is presence of scent in the insect, but in the wind there is no scent. There is also presence of nectar in the insect, but there is no presence of nectar. There is absence of nectar in the wind-pollinated flowers. Pollen grains are rough, sticky, and relatively few. Pollen grains are light, smooth, and very numerous in the wind-pollinated flowers. Anthers may or may not be enclosed by petals, but filaments are long so that anthers hang out of the flower. The anthers are up so that they can easily be blown by wind. That is in wind-pollinated flowers. Stigma is flat or lobed with sticky surface, easy adherence to pollen grain. Stigma are large and feathery. The shape of the floral parts are such that they enable insects get dusted with pollen grains. That is, there is particular adaptive shape as flowers are small and exposed. So these are some of the differences between insect-pollinated flowers and wind-pollinated flowers. So my students, I have an assignment for you to do before I go. My students, let me just quickly look at what we have seen. We have looked at the agent of pollination. We said we have two agents of pollination. We have wind and we have insect. So flowers that are pollinated by insects, we said they have brightly colored petals, and the petals are broad. And they have scent, they have nectar. The scent and the nectar and the bright color is what attract insects to come and pollinate the flower. While flower pollinated by wind are not having any nectar, they are not having scent, the petals and the sepals are not brightly colored because they are pollinated by wind. Then when you look at the pollen grains of wind-pollinated flower, they have a structure that makes them to fly in the air because they are being pollinated by wind. While pollen grains that are being pollinated by insects, they have a sticky surface in such a way that if the insect lands on the flower, it sticks to the body of the insect. And in the process, when the insect visits another flower, the pollen grains is being deposited on the stigma of the flower. And again, the anthers of the wind-pollinated flowers are on top of the flowers. They are outside, so that in such a way that if the wind blows, the pollen grains are being released into the stigma of the flower. So we have seen what the agent of pollination are and the characteristics of agent of pollination. We have seen the differences between these insect-pollinated flowers and wind-pollinated flowers. But before I go, my student, I would like to give you an assignment to do at home. And my assignment number 1 is differentiate between the following: homogamy and dichogamy. If you can remember, in our last lesson we treated homogamy, and in this lesson we treated dichogamy. So what's the difference between the two? What is the B part? What is the difference between protandry and protogyny? Number 2, mention the essential and non-essential part of the flower. Number 3, in a tabular form, state 5 differences between wind and insect-pollinated flower. I will take the assignment again. Number 1, differentiate between the following. A, differentiate between homogamy and dichogamy. B part, differentiate between protandry and protogyny. Number 2, mention the essential part and the non-essential part of the flower. We have done that in the previous lesson. Number 3, in a tabular form, state 5 differences between wind and insect-pollinated flowers. So for reference purposes, we have 2 books, Essentials of Biology for Senior Secondary School by Michael MC. Then we have Modern Biology for Senior Secondary School by Sarojoni TR. For reference purpose, okay. My contact numbers, for reference purpose, we have 2 books. We have Essential Biology for Secondary School by Michael. Then we have Modern Biology for Senior Secondary School, also by Sarojini. So my name is Mariam Ahmed Gidado, and my contact numbers are 070-586058 and 08028567623. I will repeat my number again. I am Mariam Ahmed Gidado. My number is 070-31586058. There is another number, 08028567623. So till we meet in the next lesson. Good day, students.